In a world where talent is evenly distributed, but venture capital is concentrated in coastal silos, smart startup money is heading for the Midcontinent. Welcome to the Midcon Markup, a podcast that uncovers the inspiring stories of our visionary tech entrepreneurs and the investors who believe in them. I'm your host, Cody Merrill with Cortado Ventures. Listen, learn, and make your Midcon Markup.
All right, well, thank you everybody for joining us here for our second Midcon VC Summit. It's just really incredible to go from an event that we planned in 2 months last year to this incredible experience in Bentonville, partnership with the Waltons, this world-class economic opportunity for startup innovation. And I couldn't be happier to be here with Rich Roll. Rich has been through an incredible amount of hardship in his life, and each time when the bell is rung, he's been able to get up and get off the mat, pick himself up, and dive into a passion and overcome adversity. And now he's one of the world's top podcasters, famous author, and I cannot wait to hear his insights and how he's overcome these burdens and his new business ventures. So Rich has overcome debilitating alcoholism that wrecked his life. From there, he went on to become one of the top ultra-endurance athletes in the world, and now hugely successful influencer. Rich, what is your why?
Coming out of the gate hot.
Yeah.
Well, first, let me just say thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here. Over the last day or so, I've had the opportunity to meet some of the members of your community, and I'm duly impressed with how purpose-driven everybody is, and also equally impressed with Bentonville. It's my first visit here, and very grateful to be here, so thank you. To answer your question, what is my why? My why is to empower as many people as I possibly can in the most meaningful way to set them on a trajectory towards positive change and continual evolution.
Well, can you help us turn back the clock a little bit and talk about your childhood, some formative experiences that you've had, maybe some insecurities that you had from childhood that made you ripe for addiction later in life?
I'm a naturally an introverted person who can sometimes get up on stages like this and be temporarily extroverted, but fundamentally, I'm sort of a quiet loner type. And as a child, I was very insecure. I was very challenged at the prospect of making friends. I had difficulty fitting in, and always felt like I lacked this certain roadmap for life that seemed to come easily for other kids. And so I struggled socially, I struggled academically, until I found the sport of swimming at a young age, which was like the only thing that I showed any natural sort of disposition or acumen for. Joined this very high-powered swimming club where I grew up in Washington, D.C., and realized very quickly that I lacked a certain level of God-given talent that all these other kids seemed to have. But what I did realize was that I had this capacity to suffer, to outwork everybody in the room. And it didn't take me long applying that trait to bridge that talent deficit gap and outpace my peers. And that translated into the classroom, where I went from somebody who struggled academically to, by the time I was a senior in high school, graduating at the top of my class, and also being one of the most sought after high school swimming talents that was recruited at all the colleges. I got into all the Ivy Leagues, Harvard, Princeton, Stanford. And so at 18, I was a kid who had an unbelievable amount of promise in my life. That is in no small part due to parents who supported me. All my needs were met. But it wasn't long after that moment that I discovered alcohol, and all that promise slowly kind of went down the drain. Slowly, not immediately, and all of the ambition and all of the hopes and dreams that I had as this upwardly mobile person for whom the world was truly his oyster started to kind of slowly vanish. And along with it, my self-esteem, as I became progressively more and more isolated and reaping more and more chaos in my life and alienating all the people that I cared about, until at the very end, I was literally sleeping on a bare mattress in an unfurnished room with a family that didn't want anything to do with me anymore, on the precipice of getting fired from my law firm job. I was a lawyer at this point, and really unable to live and hoping to die. And that's where sobriety came in, and I began the process of rebuilding my life, which I'm sure we'll get into. But I guess the point being that I've always struggled with connection and friendship and love. And I think those things fundamentally married with this transactional relationship with love that meant that I would receive love only when I was achieving or succeeding at things, created this disposition that made me very susceptible to the lures of drugs and alcohol.
Hearing how you tell how you slipped into alcoholism, can you provide maybe an example or two of crucible moments where you felt like maybe it gave you a little liquid courage and that helped you feel more secure and outgoing, and then eventually like what helped pull you out of it?
I'll tell one story if you'll indulge me.
All right.
This was on a recruiting trip to the University of Michigan. They were recruiting me for the swimming team. I'm from Michigan originally. My parents went to everybody in my family went to the University of Michigan, including my grandfather, who was captain of the University of Michigan swim team in the late 1920s and had been an Olympic hopeful and an American record holder, had swum for a coach called Matt Mann, and that's the name on the building, on the natatorium at the University of Michigan. So there's a little bit of a legacy there. The day that I was there had been a dual meet, and in the aftermath of this swimming competition, there was a house party. And I was brand new to alcohol at this point, and went to this house party, and they're tapping the keg, and a beer is handed to me. And I just remember, like, the first experience of feeling inebriated was as if I was being wrapped in a warm blanket, and all the problems that I never even knew that I had seemed to vanish. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I thought everybody else felt all the time. And all I could think was, this is how I want to feel all the time, as much as possible. And at that same party, I was introduced to a guy called Bruce Kimball, who was on the diving team. He pumped the keg, handed me another beer, and I'm just staring at this guy because he was an icon, a legend at the time. Other than Greg Louganis, he was the most successful and accomplished diver of his era. His father, Dick Kimball, was the diving coach at the University of Michigan. And what I didn't know at this time was that all of his hopes and dreams would be crushed by alcoholism, and that he would, only a few years into the future, careen his car into a crowd of young people, killing, I think, one person or two people, and ended up in jail for a very long time. It was almost like a foreshadowing of what my future might look like. But in that moment, I was just so enamored that I was in a conversation with this person. We were sharing a beer, and he held his beer and he said, "Watch this." He's holding his like solo cup of beer from the keg, and he proceeded to do the greatest party trick I have ever seen, where he launched himself off the ground and executed an absolutely 10 out of 10 backflip, landed on his feet, and did not spill 1 ounce of that beer in his hand. And all I could think was, whatever that guy has, that's what I want. And I think that like cemented in my mind, this kind of experience that I was in search of for the next many years.
What does rock bottom look like for you in your journey with alcohol?
I mean, rock bottom is a very subjective thing, and it's different for everybody. Rock bottom, my definition of rock bottom is when the pain of your circumstances exceed the fear of change or of doing something different. And I've had many rock bottoms. As anybody who has any experience with addiction, drugs and alcohol, or some kind of behavioral addiction like gambling or sex and love addiction, you realize that when you think you've hit bottom, there's always another layer that you can go to. That elevator is going down, and just when you think it's hit, the basement, that there's another floor for it to go down. And so my bottom was a succession of very low moments in which I promised myself I was going to change and never do this again. And that included like a marriage that went sideways and ended on the honeymoon. Like I reaped a lot of chaos. I've had 2 DUIs in a period of 2.5 months, both of which resulted in short jail stints and having my license revoked and my boss finding out and almost getting fired. Like a series of events that any rational person would say, hey, maybe it's time to make a change. But in my case, was not enough until one day after a bender, I woke up hungover, having that experience that I'd had thousands of times before, but something was different. There was no drama that day. There was no chaos. It was kind of a mundane morning in which I woke up foggy-brained and just had a moment where the seas parted, and suddenly I was blessed with a level of willingness to actually put into action something that would ultimately change my life. And that's what led me to enter a treatment center where I lived for 100 days, and that gave me a whole new set of tools for how to live. But on paper, that day, which was technically my bottom because it was the day that I made this fundamental change, wasn't my lowest moment. And I think that gets missed in the conversation around addiction and alcoholism and how wily and baffling it can be.
So in your book, Finding Ultra, there was a quote that really seemed to stand out to you that your counselor at the facility says, and he told you that you were, quote, just a garden variety alcoholic. Why did that hit you so strong?
Because every alcoholic thinks that their problems are so unique and impossible for anyone to understand. Like, you have no idea the pain that I'm in and the circumstances that I find myself in. There's no way that anybody else could possibly understand this and help me. And I think that keeps us isolated and small and avoidant when it comes to not only raising our hands and asking for help, but actually receiving help. And what you realize in recovery is that although the facts of other people's experiences may differ, the emotional experience of what it feels like to be in that state of addiction is quite common. And my drunkalog is really not all that dramatic. Like, it's actually pretty boring. It's very little sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and a lot of kind of just sad, pathetic loneliness. And I think disabusing somebody who is suffering of that idea of terminal uniqueness and helping you to understand that, like, you're actually really no different than anybody else is a necessary humbling that's required to instill or cement that level of willingness that is actually required in order to begin the journey of sobriety. It's really all about willingness. And willingness is not something that you can externally impose on another individual. It has to be internally motivated and internally driven, which makes it, again, such a baffling disease, especially for loved ones who have somebody that they care about who's suffering and they want to help them, and that person is resistant to help. You want them to be willing, but you can't make them willing. And you can send them away or provide help for them, but if that person isn't actually willing to receive that help and do the work, there's very slim chance that it's actually going to make a long-term difference for that person.
In your book, you mentioned that your father gave you a dose of tough love, and that seemed to help you really look at yourself in the mirror, and it seemed like it was helpful for you. What would you recommend for people in the audience who have a loved one experiencing alcoholism, like on the spectrum of complete tough love to full enabler? What do you think is optimal? It's
really the hardest question to answer, and it's a dynamic that I found myself a part of many times in the last 25 years. If you're a parent and you have a child who's suffering, or a partner or a loved one, and you want to help them, and again, it goes back to this willingness thing, but they're resistant to help, how do you behave? What do you do to try to be of loving assistance to that person? And for some people, the solution is tough love, and for other people, the solution is overdoing attention. You know, I think it's very case dependent and contingent on that person's wiring. But I think the important thing is that for the family member who's trying to help, who's in their own suffering over all of this because it's so terrifying. The important thing is to make sure that you're taking care of yourself, and whether that means going to Al-Anon or getting some tools for yourself and some community around this conundrum that you're facing, I think that's absolutely crucial. And then I think second to that is making sure that the person who's suffering understands that you love them, but you don't love the behavior. Like creating differentiation between the person and the actions. Like, I will not stand for these actions anymore, and creating a boundary around that. Like, I'm not available for you to call me in the middle of the night and ask me for money or whatever, thing that's happening that's causing a lot of confusion and chaos. But I am available when you're ready for help. I'll be the first person there to help you. So call me when you're ready. Don't call me about all the other stuff. Behavior and actions on the one side, and the person and their humanity on the other side. And then understanding that disease of addiction overrides that person's humanity. They're not bad people. They're just being driven, compelled by this illness that is making them do things that are at odds with the person that they actually are. So that's important as well, like not personalizing the behavior and understanding that the person you know and love is still there. It's just that their operating system has been hijacked.
So to shift gears a little bit, one of the things that I think really stands out about you in your writing and your podcast and speaking with you today is how willing you are to be vulnerable to the world, to share your worst misdeeds or internal dialogue. Why is that so important for you to include that vulnerability in your messaging? How does that help you relate to the audience? And ultimately, what can founders in the audience here take away from that from a storytelling perspective for selling their vision of the world?
I think vulnerability is the great connective tissue between human beings that make us feel less alone. Nobody wants to hear about how great you are and all your amazing accomplishments, but when you share a failure or you admit a weakness, for some reason, that makes us emotionally feel closer to that person. They feel like more like a human being. Vulnerability, unfortunately, is sort of couched as a weakness, something to be afraid of. And in certain cases, vulnerability can be weaponized by another person against that person. So there's a reason to be trepidatious about, kind of sharing something that maybe you're embarrassed about or perhaps have a little bit of shame about. But I think the practice of vulnerability leads to freedom. And this is something that I learned in the halls of recovery. I mean, basically, when you go to AA meetings, somebody gets up in front of a bunch of people and starts talking about the craziest, most embarrassing, shameful shit you can possibly imagine. And they do it with a laugh. And instead of being judged or rejected by the audience, that audience embraces them, and everybody feels closer as a result because that person has confronted those things, worked through them, and gotten to the other side where they no longer hold power over them, and they can talk about them freely without the shame and without the embarrassment. And I think that's incredibly empowering. There is a sense of freedom when you're able to do that, and when it's shared, it does create this sense of community. But of course, there's always a time and a place and a context and a modulation of that. Like, I'm not here to say that you should go and just vomit out all the craziest stuff that you've ever done thinking that this is going to make people like feel connected to you. Like, you have to be judicious about it. But I do think in the context of business and entrepreneurship, people appreciate transparency. And when you're fronting or putting on airs or a certain mask or a face because you want to be accepted or perceived in a certain way, I think that often works at cross purposes with the goal, which is to engender trust. And trust comes with honesty. And there is a level of vulnerability at times that's required to communicate honestly and transparently about what's going on with you as a founder, as an investor, as a business. Let's say something happens with the business and you have a responsibility on some level to communicate to your customer base like, hey, this thing went sideways. We're working to correct it rather than hiding it. In my experience, customers actually end up appreciating that and trusting the organization more as a result. So that would be kind of like a relatively benign example of what I'm trying to say.
So to get back to the timeline of your story, how old were you when you got sober?
31.
You're 31. Now, can you take the audience to that moment, your fateful moment on the stairs when you got out of breath walking up a small flight of stairs, and how did that set a cascading sequence of events in your life?
I got sober at 31. I spent 100 days in a treatment center, which is kind of a long time. And when I emerged from that experience, building a strong foundation of sobriety was like my number one priority. I returned to Los Angeles where I was a practicing attorney. But AA was really my job. Like, I really was intent on repairing all the wreckage that I had created as a result of my drinking and using, and restoring that promise that I had squandered as this young person that I'd spent many years, kind of wasting away. And so my goal was to become a responsible member of society again, to be somebody who could be trusted at their word, who would show up when they said they would show up, and get back on that kind of ladder of social respectability, which in my case meant, like, I'm going to go back to this law firm, I'm going to get on the partnership track, and I'm going to be that person that everybody thought that I was when I was 18. Like, that was my animating force. But never once did I ever engage in any self-reflection about whether that ladder had been placed on the correct wall, or whether I was actually, in a career that suited me, let alone what is it that I actually want to do? Like, I was on a hamster wheel, on this hedonic treadmill of accomplishment, in search of love, acceptance, and approval, which I received when I would hit certain benchmarks. And so, despite the spiritual nature of my recovery program and the fact that it encouraged a certain level of self-reflection, I wasn't really ready to engage with that. And so from 31 to almost 40, that's what I was doing. I was a workaholic, and I began to medicate my kind of emotional discontentment with unhealthy lifestyle choices, fast food diet, 80-hour work weeks, wasn't really taking care of myself in any real way, had stopped exercising, put on 50 pounds, and was just sort of I wasn't like obese, but I looked like a guy who was riding up and down an elevator in a law firm and working a lot of late nights, basically, and hitting the drive-thru on the way home.
The old dad bod?
Yeah, basically, at 39. And then, shortly before I turned 40, I did have this moment where I'd worked late that night and came home, family's asleep, and I'm making my way up the staircase to go to my bedroom. And I had to pause halfway up the flight of stairs. I was like winded and out of breath and had some tightness in my chest. And that really broke this denial that I was under, that I was still this like Stanford swimmer. I would look in the mirror and still think that I was 21 years old and like world ranked in the 200-meter butterfly. And nothing could be further from the case. Like I was like, and heart disease runs in my family. My grandfather, the champion swimmer from Michigan, had died very young of a heart attack. And my mother would always say, like, you got to watch what you eat and you got to take care of yourself. You don't want that to happen to you. But, when you're young, you just, you yada, yada, yada that. And I'd never really reflected on my lifestyle habits until that moment. And it was a very specific, vivid moment that felt very much like that day that I decided to go to that treatment center. It was a line in the sand moment. And because that morning, many years ago, I had made that phone call and booked that plane ticket to go to that treatment center, this understanding, this like appreciation for just how dramatically that changed my life. I had this sense that I was once again being visited by another kind of moment of potential energy, that if I could summon the presence of mind to appreciate and honor and follow up with some form of action, that I could once again set myself on a new trajectory. Because I had had that other experience, that I was able to see that I was once again being given that opportunity. And in the wake of that, like, that's what I did. I took action. The first thing I did was I addressed my diet, and changes in my diet led to an invigoration around like getting fit again. And it was one thing that led to another. There was never a plan that I was going to reinvent myself as a ultra endurance athlete in my 40s, I just went on this exploration of self-care that was a means of addressing not only this health scare that I had had, but also this existential crisis about what I was doing with my life.
So your selection of diet, veganism, and then your selection of athletic endeavor, ultra endurance, those are the extremes of human behavior. Why did you go that route? And does that have anything to do with your just general susceptibility to addiction? Like, another thing that you mentioned in your book is that you used to get a venti coffee and then add 4 or 5 espresso shots just for the hell of it, which I personally identified with.
I am a man of extremes, and I've learned to own that about myself, and have learned to kind of try to channel those impulses in healthier ways. But for me, incremental changes just don't work. Like, I need guardrails and I need binaries. So when I got sober, sobriety is very binary. You're either drinking and using drugs or you're not. There's no gray area where it's kind of in between. And when I decided to change my relationship with food, part of the initial impetus into eating a 100% plant-based diet was similar. Like, I need a rule, like, oh, no animal products. Like, that removes decision fatigue. I'm just not going to do that. When I did that, I felt better. And that is a rule that I can adhere to that makes sense, that doesn't require a lot of like mental gymnastics, because that leads to all kinds of machinations in my mind around excuses or alleyways where I can justify behavior. Like, all of that gets removed, right? Like, this is what I'm doing. That makes sense. And as long as I adhere to that, my life actually is starting to get better. I feel better, et cetera. So I think that was part of a way of reining in it seems like extreme, but actually to me, it allowed the extreme nature, my kind of extreme disposition, to settle into a routine. And I know that I'm best when I have a routine, I'm a creature of habit, and I stick to that routine.
Another really interesting part of the story that I identified with as a founder is that throughout like much of this Herculean hero's journey that you've been through, from alcoholism to like extremely unhealthy diet and exercise and BMI, to ultra endurance and training for that. I mean, you can't just decide overnight that you want to be an ultra endurance athlete. Like, that requires an enormous commitment of time. And one of the things that was so fascinating is that you were broke for most of that journey. You just had this internal conviction that you were on the right path. And there was a story that really stood out to me in your book about you were on a cycling trip to Ojai, and you had a very strict training regimen, and you had miscalculated your caloric intake that you needed for that ride, and you found yourself being starving, and so you went dumpster diving in Ojai and even resorted to cheeseburgers because you didn't have the money to pay for food and you were too proud to ask. How did you manage that personal financial stress? And how should founders think about that personal financial stress when they've made choices to forego more conventional and safe, financially safe career paths for the potential to build something that they believe is great and true to themselves?
It's hard. That experience is still to this day so embarrassing to hear somebody relate. But yeah, we went through a very extended period of what my wife calls our financial dismantling. Well, we were in this process of trying to reconfigure how we were living our lives. And, you know, for me, part of the allure of training for an ultra endurance race was that it required that I spend an incredible amount of time alone, like running, cycling, et cetera. And I needed that space and that time to wrestle with this existential crisis that I was having. Like, there was something about being in a state where your heart is beating and your breath is elevated and you're connected with yourself in a very tactile way that allowed me to kind of reconnect with who I was and begin to grapple with and answer these questions that I was asking myself about who I wanted to be and what I wanted to do. And all I could tell you is that there was this almost mystical, deep conviction that, despite the fact that certainly this was no path to prosperity or even any semblance of a vocation, that it felt right to me. Like I knew that the way out of the situation that we were in was through and not by going backwards. And it's difficult to put words to that. It really was something that just was a truth that lived and breathed inside my intuition. And I think that is what, in part, allowed us to navigate the difficulties of our finances at that time. I mean, we couldn't pay our mortgage. I had cars repossessed. We even had our trash bins taken away because I couldn't afford the $80 to pay waste removal. Like, it was a very difficult time. And there were many instances in which I really thought, this is insane. This is irresponsible. I have kids. Like, who does this? All I have to do is make a few calls and I could end up back at some law firm and pay the bills. And it was really my wife's deep and profound conviction in the possibility of what could be that kept us staying the course. Like, she's always said that, you know, she could see the better me starting to shine through, and she just knew in her deepest self, like, that whatever answers we were seeking were going to be found on the other side of this, and that we just had to stay in it. In terms of lessons or wisdom that I could share with founders or entrepreneurs about how to weather hardship, this thing that I endured was very specific to me. So it's hard for me to extract, like, here are the lessons that you should learn from this experience. But I will say that it helps to go through the difficult times that you're inevitably going to face in business. You're not going to obviate yourself from, you know, the many challenges that are in the near and far future if you're trying to build something meaningful. Having that faith and that intuition and that sense that this is what you're meant to be doing, and the mission being girded by a sense of purpose and meaning that exceeds the trivialities of the ego and is intended to be an offering of service to solve a problem or to be helpful to other people, I think helps. And motivation is important. Like, is this about you or is this about something greater than you? And when the mission, the business, the entrepreneurial journey that you're on is about something greater than your own self-aggrandizement, it makes it a lot easier to weather those challenges. And then surrounding yourself by people who can give you the hard feedback, but also be the encouraging voice when you need it to stay the course, I think is absolutely key as well.
I'm glad that you mentioned Julie. And I was telling you the other day that in your book, the way that you speak about her, like, she just has sage-like advice. She's just never-ending support. It really seems like an angel of a human. But you had several other people on your journey that provided support that, as a founder, I found, you know, similar archetypes in my life, whether it's family, business partner, employee, mentor. I'd be interested to just walk through a few of them, and maybe you could share a little bit about what that person meant to you in your journey, and then relate that to, like, a similar role for a founder. What about your mentor, Chris Houth, is it? Who is Chris?
Chris Houth is a friend, and he was my coach, my ultra endurance coach. I would not have been able to accomplish any of the things that I've done as an athlete without his aid and support and friendship and mentorship. He was absolutely crucial, and to this day is one of my closest friends and advisors and allies. And one of the pearls of wisdom that he shared with me early on as I was training for these, you know, multi-day, super long races was that the prize doesn't go to the person who goes the fastest, it goes to the person who slows down the least. That is something that I think is true in endurance sports, but also true in business and true in life. And essentially everything that I've accomplished has been the result of playing the long game, of being patient, of being consistent, of paying attention to the tiny little things that you do every single day, and building momentum around that. Everything has taken at least a decade for me to succeed at. And I think in life, we tend to get caught up in how fast we're moving. But I think far is always better than fast, and pace is always much more important than acceleration. It's not how fast you get there, it's what you're doing every single day to move the needle just a little bit forward, just a little nudge forward every single day. And when you do that every single day, you're building something that's meaningful, that will stand the test of time in the long run. I mean, this is how I've approached all of my entrepreneurial ventures. It's how I lead my life. And it's how I became successful in sport as this like middle-aged ultra endurance athlete. And that pearl of wisdom is something I think about every single day.
I've got to ask you about your partner in crime being a middle-aged ultra endurance athlete, Jason Lester. He seemed like a larger-than-life character and just a complete force of nature of a human being. Can you share about some of the hardship that he overcame and then what the Epic 5 challenge was that you guys embarked on?
So Jason Lester is a remarkable individual that I met when I competed in this race called Ultraman, which is a double Ironman distance race that circumnavigates the big island of Hawaii over 3 days. The first day you swim 10 kilometers in the ocean and ride your bike 90 miles. The second day you race 171 miles on your bike. And the third day you run a double marathon. It's a very arduous race. And Jason was a competitor that I met in that race who was not only completing it, but doing it without the functional use of one of his arms. As a result of a car accident that he had suffered as a teenager, he couldn't use one of his arms. And I thought that is the most remarkable thing. Especially imagine swimming 6.2 miles with one arm. Like, he's an incredible example of resilience and determination who inspires millions of people. And he came up with this crazy idea to do something nobody had ever tried before, which was to do an Ironman on each of the 5 Hawaiian islands consecutively. So 5 Ironmans on 5 Hawaiian islands in 5 days. And it was something he was going to do on his own, and then ultimately invited me to join him on this adventure. And it's a story I tell in my book, but we did it as an event. It wasn't like a sanctioned race. Now it is. It exists as a race. But at the time, we had a ragtag crew of people and just relied on each other to get through this thing. And I don't know that I've ever met anybody with a more powerful determination and mindset to accomplish hard things in my life. And so I owe a great deal of gratitude to Jason and this role that he played in my life at that time.
How should founders think about finding their Jason, their co-founder? What are the attributes in that partner in crime who you want in the trenches with you, helping you overcome these hurdles, push yourself past what you think is possible for your body and mind?
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot to share about that. I mean, now I have a business partner in everything that I do, and he's a remarkable serial entrepreneur who has a skill set that I lack, and we get along quite well, and we've been working together for now about 10 years. And so everything that I've built as a business person, I have to give him incredible credit for creating infrastructure and systems and leadership skills to this enterprise that I'm involved in. So whether it's a Jason, and his name is Greg, so whether it's a Jason or a Greg, I think having people in your life, whether it's a business partner, a co-founder, a lead investor, you need somebody who can see you for who you are, who knows your strengths and knows your weaknesses, and has a skill set that perhaps you lack that complements the ambition that you hold for the enterprise that you're endeavoring to create. I think that's super crucial. The person who can be honest, but dispassionate in that honesty so that it's not creating conflict. I think you need to have a receptivity to hear the hard things that you don't want to hear, and to be able to do that from a place of equanimity and objectivity as opposed to subjectivity and emotional, and allowing your emotions to flare. And I think that, in sport, you're always taught, like, train your weaknesses. Like, we all want to train our strengths because that's more fun and we look better doing it and we feel like more validated and like doubling down on our strengths, but it's really important to work on your weaknesses. But I think in business, you need to find somebody who is better at those weaknesses than you are. So rather than trying to master those weaknesses, finding a complementary individual to join in your endeavor who's very good at the things that you're weak at, so that your skill sets are not entirely overlapping, but like I said earlier, complementary. And I think in general, it's important to have a board of advisors, not just in business, but in life. You need somebody that you can call when you're having marital difficulties, who has a lot of experience with relationships. You need somebody who's very experienced in finance when you're having money issues and you need to make a big decision. You need a different individual who has domain expertise in all these different areas of your life, who can be a trusted advisor to help you make decisions. When I was newly sober, I learned that I couldn't trust my instincts. I couldn't trust my gut, and I needed to run essentially every decision by somebody else to make sure that I was making decisions that were in my best interest. And through a lot of work over the years, I'm in a place where I can trust my instincts and trust my gut, but I have this habit of not making big decisions until or unless I've already run them by a bunch of people that I trust, gathering feedback, and ultimately returning to my gut and seeing how all of those things line up. And I think that has served me well in how I've navigated not just business, but life and relationships, et cetera. And then I also, on this point of kind of mentorship at large, for the last 7 years, I've been part of a men's group where me and 7 other guys who live in my area get together every single Monday night for 2 hours, and we share what's going on in our lives in a private, kind of safe environment that's moderated by a therapist. And these guys at this point know everything about me, and I know everything about them. I can't get away with anything. If I try to say, oh, I want to do this thing, they're like, well, you did that last time, and look what happened. Maybe you should rethink this. Maybe you should think about doing this. Like, they keep me honest, and I help keep them honest. And I think that has also been crucial. It's something anybody could do in their own community and with people that they trust, and has been an absolutely indispensable and invaluable part of how I make sure that I'm making the best decisions in the best interest of my business, my family, myself, and everything in between.
In addition to guardrail practices, you also seem to have really embraced mindfulness. And you've had an entire journey on that. That's several influences, including your wife. What can you share about your journey with mindfulness, stoicism? I think you recently went on a really interesting trip to India. I think that there's some great wisdom that founders can apply.
All we have is our mind. That is truly all we have. And our lives are a product of what our mind entertains. So whether we respond maturely in a given situation or react emotionally is truly a function of our relationship with our own consciousness. We all understand and know that if we want to lose weight and get fit, we exercise and go to the gym, but we overlook and under-index on our agency and capacity to train our minds and our conscious awareness so that we can show up in the world and be our best selves. And I have just learned through trial and error and mistakes that meditation has truly been the biggest game changer in helping me interface with the world and navigate hardship, challenges, relationships, finance, business from a place of objectivity and equanimity. And equanimity is a superpower. Meditation gives you just an added moment to reflect on the circumstances that you find yourself in, to provide you with just a little bit of a buffer where you have the opportunity to choose how you've always reacted, impulsively, reflexively, or mindfully, from that place of equanimity, from that place of neutrality. And I think that this is the key to meeting the difficulties that inevitably we all face, and I can't recommend it enough. It's become just a fundamental, non-negotiable practice in my life. And I think that we sort of say, well, when I'm on the treadmill, that's my meditation. Or, when I walk home from work, that's my meditation. And I think there are meditative aspects to that, and there is a mindfulness practice piece to those behaviors. But qualitatively, like a strict meditation practice of your choice, and there's many different varieties of that, is a very different experience that when you do it consistently, you actually realize how much control, how much agency you actually have over your own mind, your thoughts, and the behaviors that flow from them.
Practically, how did you begin your meditation?
I was always resistant to it, and then I started hosting this podcast back in 2012 and started inviting meditation teachers and meditation experts on the show and having them explain to me, like, I really needed it to be spelled out to me. Like, do I really need to do this? Like, I'm busy, man, you know? Like, I really don't have time for this. This sounds very inconvenient. And I think over time, there's something inside me that wanted it, because why would I be inviting all these people on all the time? And it wore me down. And I just heard too many examples of people's lives transformed and positively benefited from it. I'm not going to tell you that, I'm perfect at it. Like, I miss days all the time. But when I'm doing it consistently, my life is, I wouldn't say drastically better, but I would say, as my friend Dan Harris would say, 10% better. Dan Harris being a former ABC war correspondent who suffered panic attacks and kind of resolved himself through a meditation practice. And now he has a podcast called 10% Happier and wrote a book of the same name. It's really powerful.
I have a general life question here, and that's about prescriptiveness of a career. So you had a guest on your podcast the other day, Cal Newport, whose message is essentially chasing your dreams is bullshit. And then you have somebody like Richard Branson that is just a full embrace of chase whatever your passion is and everything will work out on the back end. What were you doing whenever you were spending countless hours training for this ultra endurance contest that was a test of your will? You're trying to prove something to yourself. But did you have any sense of what it would lead to, how it would set up your career? Did it just feel right? And then going forward, how would you recommend people in the audience think about their careers?
Certainly would not recommend that anybody do what I did. And I wish I could tell you that, like, yes, I had this clear sense of what I was doing and where it would lead me, and that was not the case at all. I just had this, as I said earlier, like this gut instinct, this like really profound sense that this was leading me in a direction that would ultimately provide opportunity. And I didn't know what that looked like, and there was really no blueprint or roadmap for what I was doing. And, not for nothing, I had to weather the concern and the worry of friends and family who thought we were all insane. And rightfully so, like, 45-year-old man who's spending all his time like training ultra, it's like, this was not like a responsible thing to do. So again, it's not something I would recommend. And I think Cal Newport in many ways is correct. There's a lot of irresponsible messaging out there about follow your passion and just, you need to quit your job and like life is short and like do it now. And although I appreciate, of course, because of my own experience, how important it is to find something that you're passionate about, that moves you, that gets you out of bed every morning excited about your day. Like, I think that's really an important thing to honor. At the same time, I do think that there is more than adequate space for responsibility in how you kind of nurture those impulses. You don't need to like quit your job and rush into something that's half-baked. Like, if you have a good paycheck doing something that is perhaps not super nourishing while you're developing that app or working on that idea, it's okay to stay in that job until there's a responsible moment in which it makes more sense to leap. But I also think, and this is why it's complicated, from an energetic perspective, if you're straddling two worlds and you've got 1 foot in and 1 foot out and you're trying to serve two masters, that is working against the dream that you're trying to manifest. So at some point, I think it is important to go all in on the thing that you care about, but when that happens and the context around it, I think is also very case dependent. And so I'm always very careful to caution people against some spontaneous like version of what I experienced. Like, we went through a lot and it was really hard. And if I had to do it again, like, maybe I would do it differently. I don't know. It's just how it worked out, and thank God it worked out well. But there were plenty of moments where, it didn't look like it was going to work out at all, and it very easily could have, just completely capsized, and I'd probably be at some law firm right now, like, very unhappy.
We are at a startup conference, and you yourself have a startup. Can you share about what you're looking to do, expanding from your single show podcast to the network, what your goals are, what your mission is?
So I started the podcast in late 2012, so it's been a little over 11 years, and we're up to something like 850 episodes of the show. And when I started it, I can tell you that it wasn't cool to have a podcast. Like, nobody was clamoring to start podcasts. In fact, if you were to go to a cocktail party and tell somebody you had a podcast, you would get weird looks. Like, it was sort of something that hobbyists who hung out at Radio Shack would be interested in, but really nobody else. But I had fallen in love with this medium when I was training for all of these races. I was a very early adopter as a listener to podcasts, when you had to be very intentional in your desire to listen to them, because the technology tools just weren't seamless at the time. So you had to go to iTunes, find the podcast you wanted to listen to, you had to download the MP3, and then you had to bounce it to an iPod. Like, you had to really work at it. And I didn't know anybody other than myself who was listening to podcasts back then. This is like 2007. But I'd listened to thousands of hours of them. And then when I started my podcast, because there was no competition, we were able to kind of achieve some notoriety pretty quickly, because nobody else was doing anything in the health space. And that was encouragement to kind of keep going, even though almost no one listened. And I did it for probably 5 years before we began to monetize it. So I did it for free for a very long time. And the point that I'm trying to make is, I couldn't have predicted that it would become as popular a medium as it is today. But I did have a sense that it was going to grow and become more popular than it was. And I identified this white space, which was that nobody was doing it and there was no competition. And particularly in the areas that I was interested in, there was nobody doing anything. I capitalized on that, grabbed some real estate, and held on to it. And the show has grown gradually and organically over the years. There was no viral moment where suddenly it exploded. It's literally been an exercise in practicing everything that I did as an ultra-endurance athlete. Patience, consistency, momentum, showing up every day, attending to the little things, being more focused on going far than fast, putting quality over the incentives that drive audience capture today, and making sure that I'm very intentional about who I invite on the show and the kind of conversations I want to have. And as a result of that, I've built a very large, devoted audience, an audience that counts a lot of very interesting people in its midst, and I'm very proud of it, because I really believe that conversation matters. I think conversation is the one thing that we need and we rely upon in order to make sense of the world and of ourselves. It's the one thing that keeps us from our more violent nature. And I think the integrity of conversation is critical as much as it is under threat right now. And so I take the art and the practice of conversation seriously. And I've borne witness to so many lives changed as a result of this journey that I've been on. But I also recognize that I'm just one voice, and my voice is not enough. And because I've been doing this for a long time and made all the mistakes, and now hired a team and trained a team and have people on my team who know best practices when it comes to production value and how to do this correctly and how to fairly monetize it, I wanted to make what I've learned available to other interesting and important voices in the world that I think are deserving the support that I can give them and the amplification that I can devote to them. And so we started this media company called Voicing Change Media. Like everything else I've done, we're crawling before we walk, before we run. We're not in a hurry. We're more interested than far than fast, and we're more interested in pace than acceleration. But we're starting with 5 creators, and we're already getting success with them. And I'm really excited about the prospect of making my business ventures less about me and focusing more on these other voices that I can now devote myself to helping. And it feels really good.
As one of the world's top conversationalists, unbelievably authentic, genuine, huge, loyal audience, what piece of advice can you share with people in the audience about how to become better conversationalists?
People are terrible listeners. Most people don't know how to listen. And I think the art of conversation, meaningful conversation, demands a level of listening skill that eludes most people, because we're all caught up in our own internal narratives and we're thinking about ourselves or what we're going to say next or how we're going to impress this person. When I approach the conversations that I have on the podcast, I do an insane amount of preparation, like 8 to 10 hours to get ready to talk to these people. And I create a massive outline and all these topics and areas that I want to go into. But then I let it go. You have to allow a conversation to be what it wants to be, and you have to be present. So I think the key to great conversation is being present with the person that you're engaged with, listening rather than waiting for your opportunity to talk, and leading with curiosity. If you're leading with curiosity and not consumed with how you're coming off or how you're appearing or making sure that you make the point that you want to make, I think those are key fundamentals to positive conversational interactions.
Well, what an incredible talk, Rich. Thank you so much for joining us.
Can I share one last thought before we go?
Please do.
Yeah. I feel compelled to share like one kind of last piece of wisdom from my experience and these 800 some odd conversations that I've had. If there's one strain of thought or recurring theme that permeates all the work that I do, it is this idea that we're all so much more capable than we allow ourselves to believe. I've had so many conversations with people who have done remarkable things with far less talent than you would imagine, far less resources, far less opportunity. And I think we're all dancing atop reservoirs of hidden, untapped potential that's waiting to be actualized. And I think that when we recognize that and start to take actions in furtherance of that, that's, in my experience, when I see lives transformed for the better. And it's never too late. All the things that I'm doing didn't start until my mid-40s. I didn't start my podcast until I was 45. I was still competing in world championship events in my early 50s. I'm 57 now. And this year, I signed an incredibly lucrative, like multi-million-dollar shoe contract. And I'm telling you, as somebody who, as a young, adolescent, dreamed of being a professional athlete, the fact that I think I might be the oldest person with like a lucrative shoe contract is absolutely insane. And so my point is, it's never too late. There is always so much more life inside of us. And our job here on Earth is to explore that. It's to grow. It's to evolve. And it's to share what we discover in service to the furtherance and the betterment of others. And as I look around the room, I know there are so many purpose-driven founders here and investors who want to make a difference in the world. And this is your moment and your opportunity to do just that. So I applaud you for the mission that you're on. And I just want to thank you for allowing me the opportunity to share with you today. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Midcon Markup. Please hit like and subscribe for more episodes.